there, May Flom here, and one of the most frequently asked questions I get is about distress products, how I use them, what I recommend, and what the differences are. Now, I decided to make this video today. I'm calling it my distress primer, and basically what I'm going to do is just kind of talk about the various forms of distress and how I use them. For the purposes of this video, I will not be talking about distress crackle paint, distress embossing powder, or distress stickles. And the reason I won't be talking about these is because for me, these each have a very specific purpose, and you wouldn't use distress stickles instead of distress crackle or embossing instead of something else. They each have a very specific role and very specific properties, okay? The other four forms of distress, stain, ink, marker, and the newest, distress paint, there are a lot of things that you can kind of substitute out. If you don't have one, you could use a different one. So that's really what I want to focus on today. And for the purposes of this video, I'm using Spiced Marmalade because that's one of the colors that you can get in any of the four forms. Now, one of the first questions I get right off the bat, and I'll show you, this happens to be Mowed Lawn in paint form, in stain, and an ink pad. And those dark dots are because I just kept dotting more color on there. But you can see it's all very much the same color. They have a little bit of a different look because you're looking at different products, okay? This one is an ink pad, this one is a fluid stain, and this one is a paint. So they're going to be slightly different when you actually utilize them, but they're close enough together that if this general color is the color you're looking for, any one of the forms could work. So how are they all similar? Well, they're all liquid mediums of some sort, and they all are reactive with water and blendable while wet. Once dry, the distress paint is not going to be blendable and reactive with water, which makes it stand apart from the others, but the other three will be. These three, even when they're dry, they're still blending and re-wetting and different things that you can do with them. Okay, so let's get started with the basic distress ink pad. Now, what are some things that you can do with distress ink? Well, the first and the most obvious would be you could stamp with it. You could open it right up and pull out a stamp and ink up your stamp and stamp something with it. Okay? And as long as you're using, you're using a stamp and just stamping onto a dry surface, it'll give you a nice look. It's a little less, distress ink tends to be a little less crisp than, say, archival ink. That's just kind of, it's just a little, it tends to have a little softer feel, which is something I really, generally speaking, like. Another thing you can do with distress inks that I've never seen done with any other inks really, is that you can take a foam blending tool, and this is just the tool with a foam pad on it, okay, and tap it on there, and you'll want a slick surface. Personally, I like using the craft mat. I think it makes a great surface for this, and you can just tap, get a little ink on there, and then rub it right onto your surface. And because I'm working on the mat, it's going to keep picking back up that ink color, whatever ink color starts on here. I'm going to keep rubbing it off, and you'll notice that I start off of the surface because I don't want to get a hard edge or a line or anything in here. If you wanted a hard edge or a line, you can certainly get that. And I can keep going back in and adding color, and you can see how it's darkest at the edges and it fades to kind of a lighter color as I go along. And I think that's really fantastic that you can get that kind of color from the distress ink. And what I did here, and I'll do it again just to show you, I can come in with other colors. I can come in, here's the salty ocean, and I can come in here and blend in some color as well. And I will get where the two colors meet, where they meet up there and overlap, you will get great blending and totally different color variations there, which I think is extremely cool because you can get a really interesting look to your tag or your card or whatever project you happen to be working on. And to be perfectly honest, I could come through here all day long and just color. I have so much fun with this. So some of the benefits to this, because we're working with ink and it's such a small amount of ink that we're working with, you're not going to ever have this warp on you. Okay, it's very dry. It's almost instantly dry. So that's really great. Another thing you could do, of course, as I said before, it's reactive with water, which means if I squirt this with water, we're going to get water, little droplets of water on there. And when I dry it, what you're going to see is much like this one right here. You're going to see all these great little droplets of water form. And on this one, you can already see them starting to form as that tag dries, which is just, it's just so cool to get those little splatters. And people think, you're like, oh, wow. You know, if somebody just sees it and they don't know how to do it, it can really look like, oh my gosh, wow, I have no idea how she created that. It's actually quite simple. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do with the ink pads, and truly, I can't get this much of a blended soft look with any of the other forms. Really can't. If this is what you're trying to do, I feel like the ink pads are really the best thing to try to do this. The ink pads are also the easiest just to do straight stamping, just because they're the right size. They're an ink pad. You know, they're meant to do that kind of stuff. Let's talk for a minute about ink pad versus stain versus marker. When we moved to the Distress Stain, I was really excited because once upon a time, you know, to get larger amounts of ink, I would have to rub my ink pad onto, you know, just kind of tap it onto my craft mat here. And then I'd have to take some water and spray it. And you see how it's all, now we're all bubbling up and nice and liquid here. And then I would take my tag, and I'm just going to go ahead and take one I've been playing with here, and press it in there to get that nice fluid color. And this is how, you could do it with one color, you could do it with multiple colors, but this is how I had to get my, if I wanted a more liquid distress. This is what I had to do. There wasn't an alternative because there wasn't a more liquid form of distress. That's where the stain comes in. Okay, so the stain, if I wanted to get this kind of all over color washed look, or if I had a larger area perhaps that I wanted to colorize, I can just come in here with the stain and in seconds have a larger area colored. Now, I can still mist this with water. I actually find with the stains, I actually like to dry it a little bit before I mist it with water. I feel like the water, if you're wanting the spots, the really specific spots, I feel like drying it a bit before applying water is a better way to go. And if you really saturate your paper, you can see mine's kind of curling up, but you don't have to worry about it. And by the way, you don't have to heat dry. I just do this because I want to hurry up and I want to keep going. So that's why I'm doing the heat dry, but you can already see some water spots, and if I mist it again, we can probably get some more to act up here. But you can see you'll still get the, it'll still be reactive with water and blendable with the other colors and all that. And if you wanted, you could certainly use your stains in that way I showed, where you're putting them onto the craft mat. But you can see it's already very liquid. I don't have to add water to that. That would pick up right away if I just rub those like that and then ran a tag through them. And then if I just pressed a tag in there, we would get colors right away. Now, you know, if I mist some water in here, it's going to just give us even more fluid color, and I can do all kinds of, oh, you know, you guys, I could just play all day with this. But the point is, I could get a more fluid look if I add a little extra water. It's just a little easier that we can get that kind of a stained look or an all-over color on a larger surface that much faster and easier with the stains. You can also stamp with the stains, and I will use, let's see, we use some blue, okay? So I'm going to take some Salty Ocean stain here and just rub it on my craft mat, and it's beading up, and that's just fine. We don't need to worry about that. And then take your stamp, any stamp, and you're just going to want to, I usually kind of rub it around first because it helps kind of spread that out, and then I just tap. And the tapping is so that it gets stain all over it, but I don't want to like try to really soak it in because I don't want like big bubbles of color. I don't want it to get oversaturated. And then you just stamp. Okay, so yes, you can stamp with your Distress Stain just fine. I've noticed it's a little softer, just a little, hesitate to say blurrier, but kind of slightly more towards that watercolor effect if you stamp with the Distress stain. And it makes sense because it's more fluid, it's more liquid. And that brings us to the Distress markers. And the Distress markers are really great for a bunch of different reasons. Whereas the Distress inks are kind of the standard, and then of course the Distress stains are a more fluid form. The Distress marker, I kind of call it, you know, average, large, and small. Okay, I hesitate to call it medium, but I guess you call it medium. Small, medium, large, okay? This gets you the most and is the most fluid. You know, this is kind of somewhere in the middle. And then Distress marker, of course, the one end is a fine point tip, which I really don't use very much. But the other end is a brush tip. And I really like the brush tip. I use the side of it a lot, okay? And I like to use it most frequently. I use it, I mean, I could use it to edge. I've actually have in past if I wanted to edge something, I could use it to edge. I like the Distress markers for traveling because look, that's all of, I mean, that's all of them. All of them fit in this one little thing. So to travel with them, I can put them in a little pouch and hit the road, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. So they're very travel friendly. If you wanted to be able to color and stamp and stuff at, say, a crop or retreat, but you didn't want to have to bring all your ink pads, bring your markers and use them instead. Then you've got all your colors, and it was a lot less space taken up in your bag. I travel quite a bit with my markers. So what I'm doing right here is just using my markers to color or stamp, and I'm not really actually paying any attention to what colors I've used or am using or gonna use next or anything. I'm just coloring different things. Now, if you do like I do, where I'm kind of going down across and not coloring back over areas that are already colored, you can go in absolutely any order. If you want to color like a bunch of different areas and you think you might like overlap a bunch, I would just recommend starting with lighter colors and working to dark. Just because I think it's easier. If you want those lighter colors to show up, they show up a little better. Okay, so let's find here's a surface we can use here. So you're in no hurry because just like the other Distress products, Distress markers reactive with water, right? So I can take my time. I could pick a stamp that had really intricate detail. For example, I could pick like I could pick this girl, and I could sit there and like very detailed color every little bit and piece of this. Take my time. It could take half an hour. I could take all day. Whatever. When I'm done, when I'm ready, come back, and I'm just going to want to mist this with water pretty lightly. I'm doing this off camera just so I don't mist all my stuff there. But depending on your mist bottle, I have a really super fine mist bottle at the moment, so it takes a lot more sprays. Depending on your mist bottle, you kind of have to play with like how far away you want it and how many squirts it's going to take. But you want it so that the whole entire surface is obviously wet, but not any puddles of water or anything like that. And when you do this, you can get kind of a watercolor effect. Okay, and right now mine, you know, it's not too watercolory. It's still pretty crisp, but it just has that great blended color look. If I wanted, I could go back in here without recoloring. I could go back in here and mist it again and get another stamp off of it. And you'll notice when I do this again, it's going to be a little more faded than the last one. And I could even do it a third time, and this time I'm really getting it. A lot of water on this one, and let's see what happens now. And you'll see it's even lighter, and this one's even more blurred than the original because I used a great deal more water. So there's the first versus the third. Now on this first one, if I wanted, I could mist it with some more water here, and it will kind of bleed and blend a bit more, you know. And by the way, you could also do this by, you know, if you had like a pale color of Distress stain that you wanted to color over the stamp, it would do kind of a similar effect because it's not just water that it would be reactive to, but whatever colors down there would react to any other form of distress that you stuck on there. And, you know, we could talk about surfaces too. I won't get into that in this video because I think this video is going to be long enough as it is. However, we can get into, you know, what surfaces and like the specialty stamping paper or gloss cardstock. There's a bunch of different things like that we'll have to talk about some other day. So for example, on this one, I could come in here with scattered straw and run scattered straw over that stamped image. And as it dries, it'll do some blending of its own. I could even add additional water here. And you're noticing probably, you know, it does curl up on me a bit because of all the moisture, unlike when I was working just with the Distress ink pads and not a lot of water. But really, the play in this is unlimited, and a lot of things that I do or show, a lot of the techniques, you could technically use various forms of distress, and that's kind of my point in this video, is that depending on what you do, depending on how you craft, there's a lot of different forms and ways to get the look that you're going for. So before I go, let me take a minute and talk about distress paint. Today is day number 1 of me having this here in my studio, so I'm not an expert on them just yet. Haven't played with them a ton, but I'm really liking them. What I'm really liking, they've got the little balls in there, so you can shake it up real good, get it really nice and mixed up. Basically, since Distress ink pads came out, if I wanted to have Distress ink paint, and a paint that once dry was not reactive with water, I had to take Distress ink or Distress stain, put it on my craft mat, mix in with a little white acrylic paint, and custom blend my own paints. Okay, and it's a lot of work, it's a lot of mess, it's a lot of hassle. I don't do it very often unless I'm trying to get this exact color, this certain color, and I need that certain color, and that's the only way to get it. With Distress paint, I don't have to make that mess anymore, because now it's in here in the nice little paint dabber, and they are more fluid than the traditional Ranger dabber paints. They're also blendable, and they have distress properties while wet. And I think these are going to be really great. The great thing about these is that once they're dry, they're not reactive with water anymore. So when I'm doing my mixed media canvases or my journal covers or things where I want to make sure that whatever I've got on there is not going to react if it gets wet again, I don't have to put like a sealant or anything on over this. Once it's dry, it's going to be set. So that's going to be really exciting. Now the Distress paint, one thing you could definitely do with the Distress paint is you can definitely stamp with it, okay? I like, you know, there's enough, if you've been using it, there's enough paint right there to get your whole stamp inked up. And if not, I wouldn't advise squeezing it and pressing down to distribute more paint directly onto the stamp. I would do it onto my craft mat to get it going again, and then just kind of soak that back up. Just because I wouldn't want a big old blob of paint onto my stamp. Then you just have to wash that big old blob of paint off, and you know, you really don't need that much. It takes very little paint to do up a stamp. So I can do that, and I can stamp. And the thing that I'm really liking about this is stamping with paint is something I've always done. I love stamping with paint. It gives you a little bit of texture, and it gives you a little different look. It gives you a little more, like somewhere between regular ink and embossing, because you do get a little tiny bit of texture there, a little more feel to it than regular ink. The one must, you know, I'm not a big stamp cleaner. However, if you're stamping with paint, you've got to wash that paint off of your stamp before it dries, because if you don't, what'll happen, and you'll see here some because I'm not done cleaning the stamp out, you're going to get paint drying in the cracks, and eventually what's going to happen is those cracks are going to build up to the point where your stamp's not even going to work because you have so much paint in it. And yes, I've actually done that to a stamp. You'll get it so where you have so much paint in it that it no longer stamps the image, because, you know, there's no raised surfaces, there's no contrast, it's just one big flat blob. So you don't want that. You definitely got to rinse off the paint if you're going to be stamping with paint. So there you can see my stamped with Distress paint, and I have a feeling these are going to be a lot of fun, and I'm seeing a lot of possibility for those. I'll definitely be coming back with a video just about the paints and how I'm using those. Right off the bat, obviously, I see some stamping with them, a lot of canvas and mixed media work, and places where I want a matte finish texture, paint-like texture on my projects. So here's one. You can see the other thing that's good about the paint. Here you can see I stamped with pink, and then I took Salty Ocean stain and went over it, and you can see the paint it resisted the color a little, so the pink still shows through, and that really wouldn't work so well with any of the other distressed mediums. Alright, that's it for me for right now. That's my distress primer and how I'm using and loving my various distress colors. If you've got any questions, you can feel free to email me, or of course leave a comment on my blog on this post, and I'll be happy to help. I'm also putting on my blog my recommendations of, as far as like my personal most used colors in the stains versus ink pads versus the pens, and how that all works out. I wish you some very happy crafting.